A white judge frames an innocent black schoolgirl, certain that no one will believe her. He fast-tracks her case, determined to make her disappear into the system, just like he's done to so many others. But what he doesn't know? This girl isn't just anybody. Because when she makes one phone call, everything changes. Her father is the U.S. Attorney General, and he's about to bring down the entire system that protected this corrupt judge for years. How far will this man go to cover his tracks? And will justice finally be served? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling of Riverside Mall, casting warm patterns across the polished floors. Immani Briggs and her best friend Jada Coleman window-shopped their way through the high-end stores, their weekend tradition bringing a familiar comfort that made even the most expensive boutiques feel welcoming. The Saturday afternoon crowd moved around them in waves of shopping bags and conversation. "Look at these prices," Jada said, pressing her nose against a display window showcasing designer handbags. "I could pay for a whole semester of college with just one of those." She tapped the glass next to a particularly extravagant red clutch that probably cost more than both their wardrobes combined. Immani laughed, adjusting the strap of her well-worn backpack. "Maybe when we're successful lawyers, we can come back and buy the whole store." Her eyes lingered on a professional-looking tote that would be perfect for carrying legal briefs someday. "You mean when you're a successful lawyer?" Jada corrected, bumping her friend's shoulder playfully. "I'll stick to running my social media empire." Her phone chimed with notifications as if to emphasize her point. They wandered into Sterling and Noble, a boutique known for its luxury accessories. The store's leather goods section drew Immani like a magnet. Her fingers traced the spine of a butter-soft leather journal, its pages thick and creamy. The smell of expensive leather filled her nostrils, reminding her of her grandmother's old law books. "Future Harvard nerd alert," Jada announced, making Immani roll her eyes. "You and your fancy notebooks. I swear you love them more than your phone." She snapped a quick selfie with her friend in the background, already planning the perfect caption. "Can't take notes on civil rights cases with just emojis," Immani replied, carefully returning the journal to its display. The price tag alone made her wince. $150 was her entire monthly savings from her weekend job at the library. As they turned to leave the store, a rough hand suddenly clamped around Immani's wrist. The grip was tight enough to make her gasp. The unexpected contact sent a jolt through her body, like an electric shock. "Where do you think you're going?" The voice was harsh, dripping with authority and something uglier. Each word felt like a small slap. Immani spun around to face Officer Don McAllister, his security badge gleaming under the store lights. His face was red with what seemed like predetermined anger, his fingers digging into her skin. Sweat beaded along his hairline and the vein in his temple pulsed visibly. "Let go of me," Immani said firmly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "You're hurting me." She tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened, leaving white marks around her wrist. "Shut up," McAllister snapped, yanking her backward. "We caught you on camera stealing a wallet, the black Gucci one." His breath smelled of coffee and cigarettes, washing over her face as he leaned in closer. "What? I never touched any wallet." Immani's voice rose with indignation. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, shoppers stopping to stare at the unfolding scene. Heat rushed to her cheeks as whispers rippled through the growing audience. Jada stepped forward, her phone already in hand. "This is ridiculous. We've been together the whole time. She didn't steal anything." Her fingers were already recording, the red light blinking accusingly at McAllister. Another security guard materialized, blocking Jada's path. "Stay back, miss. This doesn't concern you." He was younger than McAllister but had the same hardened expression, like they'd been cut from the same cloth. The store manager appeared, a tall man in a crisp suit who didn't even bother to look at Immani directly. "I saw her suspicious behavior myself. Always the same with these people." His dismissive tone made it clear exactly what he meant by "these people." McAllister's grip tightened further. "We see your kind here all the time," he sneered, his breath hot against Immani's ear. "Think you can just walk in here like you own the place?" Spittle flew from his mouth as he spoke, landing on Immani's cheek. Immani's legal knowledge kicked in through her fear. "You have no right to detain me without evidence. I demand to see this supposed camera footage." Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. "Know your rights and never let them see you afraid." "Oh, look who knows her rights," McAllister mocked, twisting her arm slightly. "Maybe you should have thought about those before you decided to steal." His smirk grew wider, revealing yellowed teeth. Through the growing crowd, Immani noticed a man watching the scene with particular interest. He was older, wearing expensive casual clothes that somehow looked both relaxed and authoritative. His smile made her skin crawl. He observed the scene like a director pleased with his actors' performances. "Finally caught one in the act," she heard him mutter, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few onlookers nodded in agreement, already convinced of her guilt. "I'm calling her parents," Jada shouted, her fingers flying over her phone screen. "And I'm recording all of this." Her voice cracked slightly with panic, but her hands remained steady as she documented everything. McAllister started dragging Immani toward the back of the mall, his partner keeping the gathering crowd at bay. The floor seemed to tilt under Immani's feet as they moved through a staff-only door and down a fluorescent-lit hallway. The harsh lighting made the walls seem to close in around her. "Please," Immani tried one more time, her voice steady despite her fear. "Check my bag. Check the cameras. I didn't take anything." She gestured to her backpack, still zipped closed exactly as it had been all day. "Save it for someone who cares," McAllister growled, shoving her into a small room with bare walls and a metal table bolted to the floor. His push was hard enough that she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table. The door slammed behind her, the lock clicking with frightening finality. Immani stood perfectly still, taking in her surroundings. A large one-way mirror dominated one wall, and a security camera blinked in the corner. The room smelled of stale coffee and something metallic. The chair across from the table had a small stain that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Through the mirror, she could make out shapes moving in the observation room. The man from the mall floor was there, talking with McAllister and the store manager. Their laughter filtered through the thin walls, making Immani's stomach clench with dread. They weren't even trying to hide their conversation. The door creaked open and the well-dressed man stepped inside. Up close, his casual attire couldn't hide the air of authority he carried. He looked at Immani like she was something stuck to the bottom of his expensive shoes. His cologne filled the small space, expensive but overwhelming. "You should have just stayed in your place, girl," he said, his voice smooth and cold as ice. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving Immani alone with the blinking red eye of the camera watching her every move. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth, but Immani squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She might be locked in this room, but she refused to let them see her break. The camera continued its silent vigil, recording everything as voices murmured beyond the one-way glass. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that truth was on her side, even when justice seemed far away. The interrogation room's silence pressed down on Immani like a physical weight. The only sounds were the methodical ticking of a wall clock and the occasional crackle of security radios from the hallway outside. Her confiscated phone felt like a missing limb, leaving her cut off from everyone who could help. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The metal chair grew increasingly uncomfortable beneath her, but Immani refused to show weakness by fidgeting. She kept her posture straight, her expression neutral, even as her mind raced through every legal precedent and civil rights violation being committed against her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the bare walls. Immani's throat felt dry, but she hadn't been offered water. She wondered if that was intentional, another small cruelty designed to break her spirit. Through the one-way mirror, shadows occasionally moved past, reminding her that she was being watched. Each time footsteps approached the door, her heart would jump, only to sink again when they continued past. The clock ticked past another hour. Immani's wrists still bore red marks from the security guard's grip. She rubbed them absently, trying to focus on anything but the growing knot of fear in her stomach. Without warning, the door burst open with enough force to make her flinch. 2 police officers entered. Not mall security this time, but actual uniformed cops. Their badges caught the harsh lighting as they approached. "Stand up," the taller officer commanded, already reaching for his handcuffs. Immani rose slowly, her legal knowledge kicking in through her fear. "I have the right to make a phone call. I need to contact my parents." The officers ignored her completely. Cold metal closed around her wrists with a decisive click that seemed to echo in the small room. "Immani Briggs, you're under arrest for shoplifting," the second officer recited mechanically. "You have the right to remain silent." Her voice shook despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Please, I need to call my parents. This is all a mistake." Again, they acted as if she hadn't spoken. Each officer took one of her arms, steering her toward the door and through a maze of back corridors. The service hallways were deserted, clearly chosen to avoid any public witnesses to her arrest. They emerged through a rear exit into the cold afternoon air. A police cruiser waited, its engine idling. The officers guided her into the back seat with practiced efficiency. The interior of the police car felt like a cage. Cold metal pressed against Immani's back through her thin hoodie. The partition between the front and back seats created a barrier that felt both physical and symbolic. As the car pulled away from the mall, reality crashed over her like a wave. This was really happening. She was being arrested for something she didn't do. The drive to the police station passed in a blur of streetlights and sirens. Inside the station, Immani was processed like she'd seen in countless TV shows, but the reality felt surreal. Her fingerprints were taken, pressed into black ink and then onto stark white cards. A mugshot followed. Turn left, turn right. Hold the number board. They led her to a holding cell, pushing her inside without ceremony. The cell smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. Other detainees watched her with dull eyes as she found an empty spot on a bench. Through the bars, she could hear fragments of conversation between passing officers. "Judge Grayson wants this one handled quickly. Shouldn't be any problems. Keeping it quiet." Immani's legal knowledge told her this wasn't right. None of this was following proper procedure. She called out to a passing officer. "I need to speak with a public defender." The officer barely glanced her way. "Already been handled." "What do you mean handled?" "I haven't spoken to any lawyer." "Your case has been assigned to Judge Grayson's court. He'll handle everything." The words hit Immani like a physical blow. The same man who had watched her arrest with such satisfaction would now be deciding her fate. Hours passed in the holding cell. Then, without warning or preparation, officers came to escort her to the courthouse. Still in her mall clothes, jeans, hoodie, and sneakers, Immani was led into a courtroom that seemed designed to intimidate. Judge Walter Grayson sat on the bench like a king on his throne, his black robes a sharp contrast to the casual clothes he'd worn at the mall. His smirk was barely concealed as he looked down at her. The gavel slammed down with devastating finality. "Due to the serious nature of this crime and the clear evidence at hand, this court will proceed with an expedited trial tomorrow morning." Immani's voice found strength despite her fear. "Your Honor, I haven't been able to contact my parents or speak with a lawyer. I request time to prepare a proper defense." Grayson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Request denied. Given the straightforward nature of this case, we'll proceed without unnecessary delays. No bail will be set at this time." The words "no bail" echoed in Immani's head as officers led her away. No jury, no proper trial, just Grayson's word against hers. That night, lying on the thin mattress in her jail cell, Immani stared at the ceiling. The concrete walls seemed to close in around her. She had held back tears all day, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. But now, in the relative privacy of her cell, they threatened to fall. A night guard passed by, keys jingling. "You get one phone call," she said, almost kindly. Immani sat up slowly. She knew exactly who she needed to call. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number she knew by heart. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like an eternity. Finally, a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Dad," Immani whispered, her voice cracking. "I need your help." Meanwhile, Marcus Briggs sat in his leather chair, surrounded by the mahogany and brass fixtures of his Washington, D.C. office. The wall clock showed 9:45 p.m., but time had little meaning when justice needed attention. Papers were scattered across his desk. reports of corruption investigations, policy drafts, and case files that demanded the Attorney General's review. His assistant, Sarah, stood by the door with a tablet in hand, finishing their evening briefing. "The task force reports should be ready by morning, sir, and Senator Thompson's office confirmed the meeting for next week." Marcus nodded, his mind already drifting to tomorrow's agenda. "Thank you, Sarah. Get some rest. We'll pick this up in the—" His private phone buzzed against the desk, its vibration oddly loud in the quiet office. The screen lit up with a familiar name, Immani. A smile crossed his face as he reached for the phone. His daughter rarely called this late, but their conversations always brightened his day. "You can head home, Sarah. I'll take this." As his assistant left, Marcus answered the call. "Hey, baby girl, isn't it a little late for—" "Dad." Immani's voice trembled, something he'd rarely heard from his strong-willed daughter. The smile vanished from his face. "Immani? What's wrong?" The words tumbled out of her in a rush, fear and anger battling in her voice. "I'm in jail. They arrested me at the mall. I didn't do anything, Dad. The security guard grabbed me, accused me of stealing. They wouldn't let me call anyone until now." Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. Years of legal training kicked in. "Slow down. Start from the beginning." Immani took a shaky breath, then explained everything. The mall, the security guard's rough treatment, the accusations. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, defiance replacing fear. "They're trying to railroad me, Dad. The judge. He was there at the mall watching it all happen, Judge Walter Grayson." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. His free hand curled into a fist on the desk. Walter Grayson, a name that had crossed his desk multiple times in corruption investigations. Always whispers, never enough evidence. Until now. "They're holding me overnight," Immani continued. "The trial's tomorrow morning. No jury, just him deciding." "Listen to me carefully," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Don't say another word to anyone. I'm handling this right now." He ended the call and immediately dialed the local police chief's number. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Chief Williams speaking. This is Attorney General Marcus Briggs." His voice carried the full weight of his office. "You're holding my daughter, Immani Briggs, on fraudulent charges. I want her released immediately." A pause. Then, "I'm sorry, sir, but we have direct orders from Judge Grayson. The case is already in the system." "I don't think you understand, Chief. I am ordering you as the Attorney General of the United States." "With all due respect, sir," Williams interrupted. "This is a local matter. Judge Grayson was very clear about the handling of this case. My hands are tied." Marcus's jaw clenched. He knew this game. The slow grind of bureaucracy. The proper channels that could take days or weeks to navigate. Time Immani didn't have. After ending the call, he sat in silence for a moment. The options played through his mind. Federal intervention, emergency appeals, media pressure. All too slow. All too uncertain. Then another option surfaced. One that made him both hopeful and slightly afraid. He reached for his phone again, scrolling to a number he rarely called this late. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Marcus, do you know what time it is?" "Mama," he said, the word carrying all the weight of his concern. "I need your help." Evelyn Briggs had been a force in civil rights law for decades. Her voice sharpened immediately, recognizing her son's tone. "What's happened?" Marcus explained the situation, his words precise and measured. He detailed Immani's arrest, the rushed proceedings, and most importantly, Judge Grayson's involvement. With each detail, the silence on the other end grew heavier. "They're holding her overnight," he finished. "Trial's set for tomorrow morning. Grayson's making sure everything moves too fast for normal procedures." The silence stretched for several long seconds. Marcus could almost see his mother's expression, the same one she'd worn during countless civil rights battles when facing down segregationists and corrupt officials. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice carrying decades of determination. "Book me the first flight out. I'm handling this myself." The words carried both promise and threat. Marcus knew that tone. It was the voice that had faced down fire hoses and attack dogs, that had argued before the Supreme Court, that had never backed down from a fight for justice. He opened his laptop, already searching for flights. "Mama, are you sure? This Judge Grayson, he's dangerous. He's got connections." So did every other racist with a gavel I've faced. Her voice carried steel beneath its calm surface. And they all learned the same lesson. You don't touch my family. Marcus could hear movement on her end. Drawers opening, closet doors. She was already packing. "I'll have a car waiting at the airport," he said. "Good. And Marcus?" There was a pause. "Don't do anything rash before I get there. I know you. You're thinking about bringing the full weight of your office down on this judge." He didn't respond immediately. She was right. He'd been considering every federal tool at his disposal. "Let me handle this my way first," Evelyn continued. "Sometimes a scalpel works better than a sledgehammer, especially when dealing with men like Grayson who think they're above the law." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, already pulling up flight information. "There's a red-eye leaving in 2 hours." "Perfect, and Marcus, tell Immani to stay strong, her grandmother's coming." The call ended, leaving Marcus alone in his office. Outside his window, the lights of Washington, D.C. sparkled against the night sky. Somewhere out there, his daughter sat in a cell, facing the same kind of injustice his mother had fought against decades ago. He booked the flight with a few quick clicks, then sat back in his chair. Despite his worry, a small smile crossed his face. Judge Walter Grayson had no idea what was coming his way. The next day, the morning sun filtered through the high windows of Courtroom 237, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations and the rustle of notepads as journalists scribbled preliminary notes. Local activists wore shirts emblazoned with "Justice for Immani" and "Stop Racial Profiling," their presence turning what should have been a routine shoplifting case into something much more significant. State Senator Williams sat in the front row, his presence lending gravity to the proceedings. Next to him, civil rights leaders from the community watched with stern expressions, their very attendance a silent protest against the rushed proceedings. At the defense table, Immani sat alone, her back straight despite the fear that churned in her stomach. She wore a simple navy blue dress borrowed from another inmate, her usual confidence dimmed by a sleepless night in jail. Her eyes remained fixed forward, refusing to give Judge Grayson the satisfaction of seeing her uncertainty. Grayson himself lounged in his chair at the bench, reviewing papers with casual disinterest. His silver hair caught the morning light, and his expensive robes draped perfectly across his shoulders. He wore the smirk of a man who had never lost a battle in his own courtroom. "All rise," the bailiff called out. "The court of the 5th District is now in session, the Honorable Judge Walter Grayson presiding." The assembled crowd rose, a symphony of shuffling feet and creaking benches. Grayson nodded, savoring the moment of deference. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of decades of unchallenged authority. "We're here today in the matter of the state versus Immani Briggs, on charges of shoplifting and resisting arrest. Miss Briggs, I see you have no legal representation. Shall we proceed with a court-appointed?" The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a decisive crack that cut through Grayson's words. Every head turned. Evelyn Briggs stood in the doorway, a force of nature in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes blazed with the fire of countless courtroom battles. She carried a worn leather briefcase that had seen more civil rights victories than most lawyers had cases. The click of her heels echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom as she strode down the center aisle. Her presence commanded attention, drew every eye. Even the journalists stopped writing, sensing that the real story was just beginning. Grayson's smirk flickered and died as he recognized her. His fingers tightened imperceptibly on his gavel. Evelyn reached the defense table where Immani sat. She placed a gentle hand on her granddaughter's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. The touch carried decades of love and strength, and Immani felt some of her fear melt away. Then Evelyn turned to face the bench, her expression carved from granite. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "I am Immani Briggs's legal representation." Her lips curved in a smile that held no warmth. "And you are about to have the worst day of your career." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Grayson's face flushed red. "Mrs. Briggs, this court will not tolerate—" "This court," Evelyn cut in, her voice sharp as a razor, "has already demonstrated a shocking disregard for proper legal procedure. Shall we discuss the violations, Your Honor? Or would you prefer I address them one by one?" She opened her briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents with practiced efficiency. "First, my client was denied her constitutional right to legal representation upon arrest. Second, no formal investigation was conducted before charges were filed. Third," she held up a document, "the mall security footage that would exonerate my client was mysteriously marked as unavailable when requested." Grayson leaned forward, his knuckles white around his gavel. "Mrs. Briggs, this court has already—" "Hamilton versus State of Georgia, 1983. Evelyn interrupted smoothly. "The precedent clearly states that in cases where evidence has been improperly withheld, the court must consider new evidence when presented, regardless of timing." She pulled out another document. "I have here a copy of the complete security footage from Riverside Mall, obtained through a federal subpoena." The gallery erupted in whispers. Grayson's face had lost its color entirely. "Bailiff," Evelyn called out, "please set up the video equipment. The court needs to see this evidence." A screen descended from the ceiling as the bailiff wheeled out a projector. Evelyn inserted a flash drive, and the footage began to play. The video showed the designer wallet display from multiple angles. Timestamp: 2:47 p.m. A white teenage boy in an expensive jacket lingered near the display, glancing around furtively. His hand moved quickly, slipping a wallet into his jacket pocket. The timestamp showed 2:49 p.m. The footage continued. At 3:15 p.m., Immani and her friend Jada appeared in frame, nowhere near the display when the theft occurred. They were clearly visible looking at journals in a completely different section of the store. The courtroom erupted. Journalists furiously scribbled notes. Activists in the gallery stood up, pointing at the screen. The truth was there in black and white, impossible to deny. Immani felt tears of relief prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back, maintaining her composure. She wouldn't give Grayson the satisfaction of seeing her cry, even in victory. Grayson's face had turned an ashen gray. He stared at the screen, then at Evelyn, who met his gaze with steel in her eyes. She leaned forward, placing both hands on the defense table. "This case isn't just over, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent courtroom. "It's about to turn into a much bigger problem for you." The courtroom exploded into chaos as the security footage played on the large screen. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated dozens of shocked faces in the gallery. Gasps and exclamations echoed off the wood-paneled walls as the truth unfolded before their eyes. On the screen, the actual thief, a white teenager in an expensive leather jacket, was clearly visible pocketing the designer wallet. Meanwhile, the timestamp proved that Immani had been nowhere near the display when the theft occurred. The journalists' pens flew across their notepads, documenting every detail of this stunning revelation. In the front row, civil rights leaders exchanged knowing glances. Even Judge Grayson's longtime clerk, Mrs. Peterson, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, unable to meet anyone's eye. "Order! Order in my court!" Grayson's voice boomed as he slammed his gavel repeatedly against the wooden block. The sharp crack echoed through the room, but it couldn't fully silence the wave of whispers spreading through the gallery like wildfire. "Did you see that? They arrested the wrong person. That poor girl." Evelyn Briggs stood at the defense table, her posture relaxed but commanding. Her gray hair caught the morning light streaming through the high windows as she turned to face the bench. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a fierce intensity that made even veteran courtroom observers lean forward in their seats. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the room, "would you like to explain why this evidence was never presented?" Each word landed like a carefully placed chess piece, setting up a game that Grayson was already losing. The judge's jaw clenched visibly, the muscles working beneath his skin. His usual air of smug authority had vanished, replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. "It must have been a clerical error," he managed, but his voice lacked conviction. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, more insistent. Evelyn allowed them to build for a moment before turning to address the jury. She moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms just like this one, fighting battles just like this one. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice taking on a tone of controlled outrage, "let's talk about why my granddaughter was singled out, while the actual thief walked free." She reached into her worn leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders, each one stuffed with documents. "I have here," she continued, holding up the files, "every juvenile case that has come before Judge Grayson in the last 10 years. She placed them on the evidence table with a solid thump. "The statistics tell a disturbing story." The courtroom fell silent as Evelyn began laying out the numbers. Her voice was measured, but each fact landed like a hammer blow. 95% of all juveniles convicted in this courtroom were black. She paused, letting that sink in. "When we compare sentences, we find that black minors consistently received punishments 3 to 5 times harsher than their white counterparts for identical offenses." She pulled out another document, this one bearing official letterhead. "But perhaps most troubling is this pattern. Judge Grayson has repeatedly sentenced black youth to privately run juvenile detention centers that coincidentally have suspicious financial ties to his office." The gallery erupted again, louder this time. Several journalists jumped to their feet, shouting questions. Civil rights activists in the back began chanting, "Justice! Justice!" A woman in the front row burst into tears, likely remembering her own child's case before this very judge. Grayson's face had turned a dangerous shade of red. His hands gripped the edges of his bench so tightly his knuckles showed white. "This is irrelevant to today's trial," he shouted, but his voice cracked slightly on the last word. Evelyn turned slowly to face him. The morning sun streaming through the windows cast her in sharp relief, highlighting the steel in her spine and the fire in her eyes. She locked gazes with Grayson, and for the first time in decades the judge found himself unable to maintain eye contact. "Oh, I promise you," Evelyn said, her voice low but carrying clearly in the suddenly hushed courtroom. "It's very relevant. Because after today, the only trial happening will be yours." The words hung in the air like smoke. Several members of the jury nodded slowly, their expressions hardening as they looked at the judge with new eyes. Grayson's composure finally cracked. He grabbed his gavel with a shaking hand. "This court will take an immediate recess," he announced, his voice higher than usual. Without waiting for a response, he stood abruptly, his robes swishing as he practically fled from the bench. Through the glass windows of the courtroom doors, Immani could see reporters already gathering in the hallway, their cameras ready. Grayson avoided them all, ducking down a side corridor, his shoulders hunched. His usual confident stride was gone, replaced by the hurried walk of a man who knew he was in trouble. Immani watched him go, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had seen Judge Grayson sentence countless kids from her neighborhood, had heard the stories of lives derailed by his harsh judgments. She had never imagined she would see him like this, running away, afraid. The fear that had gripped her since her arrest began to fade, replaced by something else. For the first time since this ordeal began, she saw Grayson for what he really was. Not an all-powerful figure, but a corrupt man who had finally been exposed. And now he was scared. Hours later, the evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Evelyn's law office as she and Immani sat surrounded by stacks of case files. The worn leather chairs creaked as they shifted through documents, piecing together decades of Judge Grayson's corruption. The air smelled of old paper and coffee, and the wall clock ticked steadily in the background. Immani held up another file, her hands trembling slightly. "Look at this one, Grandma. He sentenced a 14-year-old to 3 years for stealing candy, while a white teenager got community service for stealing a car." Evelyn adjusted her reading glasses, taking the file. "Add it to the pattern pile," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "We're building a clear picture of systematic discrimination." The office door opened and Marcus Briggs strode in, still wearing his suit from the flight. Despite the late hour, his presence filled the room with new energy. His eyes immediately found Immani, and for a moment the stern face of the U.S. Attorney General melted into that of a worried father. "Baby girl," he said softly, crossing the room in 3 quick steps to embrace his daughter. Immani buried her face in his chest, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability she'd been holding back all day. When they separated, Marcus's expression hardened as he turned to his mother. "Talk to me, Mama. What are we dealing with?" Evelyn gestured to the organized chaos of papers spread across her desk. "It's worse than we thought, Marcus. Much worse." She picked up a thick folder, its edges worn from frequent handling. "Grayson's been running a sophisticated operation for years. He targets black youth, especially those from low-income neighborhoods, and hands down excessive sentences." She spread out several documents pointing to highlighted sections. "These kids end up in private juvenile detention centers that coincidentally make substantial donations to various organizations connected to Grayson." Marcus leaned over the desk, his trained prosecutor's eyes scanning the evidence. "Kickbacks?" "Laundered through a network of shell companies and charitable foundations," Evelyn confirmed. "But that's just the beginning. Look at these sentencing patterns." For the next hour, they reviewed case after case. Marcus took notes on his phone, his jaw tightening with each new revelation. The picture that emerged was clear. Judge Grayson had built an empire on the backs of innocent black children, using his position to feed a profitable pipeline of young lives into private prisons. "This ends now," Marcus said, finally straightening up. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Janet? I need the Civil Rights Division mobilized immediately. Full federal investigation into Judge Walter Grayson. Yes, tonight, and get me the FBI director." As Marcus made calls, the evening news played quietly on the office television. Suddenly, Immani's case footage appeared on screen. The anchor's voice filled the room. In what many are calling a shocking example of systemic racism, security footage reveals that a black honor student was falsely accused while the actual thief walked free. The story spread like wildfire across networks. Cable news channels played the footage on repeat, social media exploded with outrage, and civil rights leaders began issuing statements demanding action. "Look at this," Immani said, holding up her phone. Justice for Immani was trending nationwide. Videos of other victims of Grayson's corruption were being shared thousands of times. The office phone started ringing constantly. Other families, emboldened by the media attention, began coming forward with their own stories of facing Grayson's prejudiced rulings. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Grayson was unraveling. In his chambers, he paced frantically, watching his carefully constructed world crumble. His face was red with rage as he confronted his longtime clerk, Mrs. Peterson. "You were responsible for evidence management," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at her. "How did that footage get out?" "You're fired." Mrs. Peterson stood her ground, years of quiet observation hardening her resolve. Without a word, she turned and walked out of his chambers. But she didn't go home. Instead, she went straight to the press, carrying a USB drive containing years of documented irregularities in Grayson's courtroom. By nightfall, new headlines were breaking. Whistleblower exposes decades of judicial corruption. The documents revealed everything: rigged cases, backroom deals, suspicious bank transfers, and emails proving Grayson had deliberately targeted black youth for his scheme. The judge sat alone in his darkened office, the only light coming from the city outside his window. His hands shook as he poured himself another drink, spilling expensive scotch on his desk. His phone had been ringing all evening with calls from reporters, but he ignored them all. Finally, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used: the private line of Senator William Harrison, his old friend from law school, the man who had helped him become a judge in the first place. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Grayson's heart pounded as he waited. 4 rings, 5. Then the automated voicemail message played. He tried again. Same result. A 3rd time. Still no answer. Grayson slumped in his chair, the reality of his situation crashing down around him. Senator Harrison had always answered his calls, day or night. The message was clear. He was toxic now, a liability to be cut loose. His hands trembled as he set the phone down. The click of it hitting his desk seemed to echo in the empty office. Outside his window, he could see news vans parked along the street, their satellite dishes reaching into the night sky like accusing fingers. For the first time in his career, Judge Walter Grayson was truly alone, and he knew, with terrifying certainty, that this was only the beginning of his fall. The next day, the morning sun blazed across the courthouse steps as Immani and Evelyn made their way through the growing crowd. What had started as a small gathering had swelled into hundreds of protesters, their voices echoing off the granite walls like thunder. Signs bobbed up and down like waves in an ocean of righteous anger. Free Immani, fire Grayson. No justice, no peace. Racist judges have no place on the bench. The energy was palpable, a living thing that seemed to pulse through the air. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Reporters clutched microphones, delivering live updates to their cameras with the passionate crowd as their backdrop. Their voices carried urgency as they described the scene unfolding behind them. Smartphones everywhere captured videos and photos, sending the scene viral within minutes, the digital wildfire spreading across social media platforms. "Look at all these people," Immani whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the sight. A lump formed in her throat. She hadn't expected this level of support, hadn't dared hope for it. A group of teenagers her age wore t-shirts with her face printed on them, along with the words, "Could have been me." Their eyes met hers with fierce solidarity. Evelyn squeezed her granddaughter's hand, her weathered fingers strong and reassuring. "This is what happens when people have had enough," she said, her voice carrying decades of civil rights experience. "One spark can light a fire of change, and baby, you're that spark today." Police officers formed a path through the crowd, their faces tense as they allowed Immani and Evelyn to reach the courthouse doors. As they walked, people reached out to touch Immani's shoulders, offering words of encouragement and support. Strangers called her name like she was family. An elderly woman with kind eyes pressed a small cross into her palm, whispering, "We're praying for you, baby. The Lord knows what's right." Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere crackled with tension. The usual morning bustle had been replaced by something different, something electric and unpredictable. Legal clerks huddled in corners, whispering and pointing at their phones as they watched the protest coverage. Some looked guilty, others hopeful. Even the security guards seemed uncertain, their eyes darting between Immani and the growing chaos outside, as if trying to decide which side of history they wanted to stand on. When they entered Grayson's courtroom, the change was immediate and stark. The judge's usual supporters, the sycophants and beneficiaries of his corruption, were nowhere to be seen. The gallery was packed instead with civil rights activists, community leaders, and families of other victims of Grayson's corruption. Their faces told stories of pain, but today, also of hope. Judge Grayson himself sat at his bench, his face ashen and drawn. The confident mask he'd worn for decades had slipped, revealing the frightened man beneath. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers, trying to maintain an appearance of control. But when he called the court to order, his voice cracked like thin ice. "Let's proceed with," he began, but stopped short when his court reporter, Mrs. Chen, remained motionless at her stenotype machine. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "Mrs. Chen?" Grayson's voice held a note of desperation, almost pleading. "Please record the proceedings." Mrs. Chen looked up, meeting his gaze steadily. Her eyes, usually downcast in his presence, now burned with quiet defiance. "No, Your Honor. I will not be party to this anymore." She stood up, gathered her belongings with deliberate calm, and walked out of the courtroom. The gallery erupted in applause, the sound filling every corner of the room. Grayson's face turned red, blotchy with rage and humiliation. "Order! I demand order!" He banged his gavel repeatedly, but the sound seemed weak and ineffective, like a child playing at authority. Lawyers who had once cowered before him now watched with unveiled contempt. Some who had cases scheduled that day began packing their briefcases, clearly unwilling to proceed under his authority. The exodus had begun and everyone could feel it. Evelyn rose from the defense table, her movement slow but purposeful, drawing all eyes in the room. She stood tall, her dignity a stark contrast to Grayson's crumbling facade. She held a thick document in her hands like a weapon. "Your Honor, I have a motion to present." Her voice carried the weight of decades fighting against injustice. "I am requesting an immediate misconduct hearing, citing evidence of systematic discrimination, abuse of power, and corruption." She approached the bench, placing the motion before him with a soft but final thud. "Furthermore, we move that you be disqualified from presiding over any future cases, pending a full investigation." Grayson's face contorted with rage. He stood up, his robes billowing around him like dark wings. "How dare you!" he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "I've been on this bench for 30 years. You have no right." "I have every right," Evelyn cut him off, her calm voice a sharp contrast to his fury. "And so do all the families whose children you've sent to prison for profit." She tilted her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "You seem nervous, Your Honor. Wonder why?" The gallery burst into murmurs as Grayson struggled to respond. His gavel slammed down again and again, but each strike seemed to diminish his authority rather than restore it. The sound grew hollow, powerless against the tide turning against him. Outside in the marble hallway, Marcus Briggs paced back and forth, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he took a call from his office in Washington. His investigators had been working through the night, following paper trails and money transfers, piecing together the puzzle of Grayson's corruption. "Sir," his lead investigator reported, excitement evident in his voice, "we've found it. Direct bank transactions from private detention centers to offshore accounts linked to Grayson. Multiple payments, going back years. We can prove he was getting kickbacks for every kid he sentenced." Marcus stopped pacing, a smile spreading across his face for the first time since this nightmare began. The weight on his shoulders lightened slightly. "How much are we talking about?" "Millions, sir, and there's more. The transactions coincide perfectly with his sentencing dates. Every time he sent a black kid to one of these facilities, money appeared in his accounts within days. It's all documented. He got sloppy thinking no one would ever check." Marcus looked through the courtroom doors where he could see Grayson still raging at Evelyn. The judge's power was already crumbling before his eyes. Now, with this evidence, it wouldn't just be his bench he'd lose. It would be his freedom. The justice he had denied to so many would finally catch up to him. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction, not just as the Attorney General, but as a father whose daughter had nearly become another victim. Days later, Judge Walter Grayson's silk pajamas clung to his sweat-soaked body as he jolted awake in his four-poster bed. The morning sun filtered through the expensive curtains of his mansion, but it brought no warmth. His hand trembled as he reached for his phone on the nightstand, nearly knocking over his glass of water. 47 missed calls, 23 voicemails, over 100 text messages. His stomach churned as he scrolled through the notifications. His law clerk, his political allies, his private attorney, even his country club friends were trying to reach him. The massive TV mounted on his bedroom wall flickered to life with a click of the remote. He almost dropped it when he saw his own face plastered across the screen, not his official judicial portrait, but a candid shot of him looking harried and desperate as he fled the courthouse yesterday. The news anchor's voice cut through the room like ice. "Breaking news. Federal prosecutors are officially investigating Judge Walter Grayson for corruption and bribery. Evidence suggests he took financial kickbacks for sentencing black minors to private detention centers. The U.S. Attorney General has confirmed that formal charges may be imminent." Grayson's hands began to shake so violently that he couldn't hold his phone anymore. It clattered to the marble floor as the anchor continued. Sources close to the investigation claim that bank records show systematic payments coinciding with each sentencing, suggesting a years-long pattern of judicial corruption targeting minority youth. He stumbled to his private bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before emptying his stomach. The cold tile pressed against his knees as he heaved, his empire crumbling around him. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Evelyn and Marcus Briggs sat in a conference room, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and empty coffee cups. The morning light streamed through the windows, highlighting the determination on their faces. "The federal injunction is ready," Marcus said, sliding a thick document across the table to his mother. "This will force him off Immani's case immediately. He won't be able to touch her or any other case until the investigation is complete." Evelyn reviewed the paperwork with practiced eyes, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "Good work. The evidence is overwhelming. He won't be able to wiggle out of this one." Across town, Grayson was making desperate phone calls from his home office. His fingers jabbed at the phone's keypad as he dialed State Senator Thompson, a man who had benefited from his arrangements for years. "James, please," Grayson pleaded, his voice cracking. "I can make it worth your while. The usual arrangement, but triple the amount. Just speak up for me. That's all I'm asking." The senator's response was cold. "Walter, don't call me again. I'm not going down with you." The line went dead. Grayson's next call was to his private attorney of 20 years, Richard Maxwell. "Richard, I need you to handle this mess. Whatever your fee is, I'll double it, triple it." "I'm sorry, Walter," Maxwell's voice was firm. "I'm withdrawing as your counsel. The evidence they have? I can't be associated with this. Good luck." Another deadline. Growing more frantic, Grayson made one final attempt. He called the governor's office, demanding an emergency meeting. His hands shook as he held for what felt like hours. Finally, an aide came on the line. "Judge Grayson, the governor is preparing to make a public statement. Please hold for the live feed." Grayson rushed to his TV just in time to see Governor Mitchell step up to a podium covered in microphones. "The allegations against Judge Walter Grayson represent a profound betrayal of public trust," the governor declared, his face stern. "If proven true, this corruption strikes at the very heart of our justice system. My office condemns these actions in the strongest possible terms and will cooperate fully with federal investigators." Grayson slumped in his leather chair, the room spinning around him. Every ally, every connection, every person he'd thought he owned, they were all abandoning him. Later that afternoon, courthouse security approached Grayson's chambers. He sat behind his desk, still wearing his judicial robes, clutching a framed photo of himself with the president from better days. "Your Honor," one officer said, not meeting his eyes, "we need you to come with us. The federal injunction has been approved. You're being removed from the bench, effective immediately." Grayson stood slowly, his legs unsteady. "I'll need a moment to gather my things." "No, sir," the officer replied firmly. "You're to leave now. Federal agents will inventory your office later." The walk through the courthouse corridors felt endless. Staff members stopped and stared. Some pulled out their phones to record his final moments. Lawyers who had once bowed and scraped before him now turned their backs as he passed. As they approached the courthouse steps, Grayson could hear the roar of the crowd outside. The security officers pushed open the heavy doors, and he stepped into a storm of camera flashes and angry voices. Protesters lined both sides of the steps, creating a gauntlet he had to walk through. They held up signs with his face crossed out and statistics about his racist sentencing record. News cameras captured every stumbling step. Someone threw the first handful of shredded paper, then another, and another. Soon the air was filled with confetti made from his old court rulings, raining down on him like justice itself. Each scrap represented a life he had ruined, a family he had torn apart, all for profit. The papers settled in his hair and clung to his robes as he made his way down the steps. Some pieces bore visible fragments of his signature, his stamp of authority now reduced to meaningless scraps in the wind. He reached the bottom of the steps where his driver had once waited with a luxury car. Now there was only an empty curb and more protesters. His power, built over decades of corruption and cruelty, had vanished in a matter of days. A voice rose above the crowd. "How does it feel to be powerless, Judge?" The question echoed off the courthouse walls, and Grayson knew he would never have an answer worthy of all the pain he had caused. The crystal tumbler shook in Judge Walter Grayson's trembling hand as he poured his fourth, or was it fifth, glass of expensive whiskey. The amber liquid splashed over the rim, staining the sleeve of his silk pajamas. He hadn't bothered changing clothes in 2 days. His mansion's grand study, once a testament to his power with its leather-bound law books and photographs of him with politicians, now felt like a tomb. The heavy curtains remained drawn, keeping out the harsh reality of the world beyond his walls. His phone buzzed again on the mahogany desk, the screen lighting up with yet another news alert. He couldn't bear to look, but his eyes were drawn to it anyway. Legal experts. Grayson case reveals systemic corruption in juvenile justice system. Another buzz. Former clerk speaks out inside Judge Grayson's racist sentencing practices. The whiskey burned his throat as he drained the glass. On the muted TV, he could see his own face plastered across every news channel. Legal analysts dissected his career, pointing out patterns he'd thought were carefully hidden. They used words like unprecedented, systematic abuse, and criminal enterprise. A sharp knock at the door cut through his alcoholic haze. Grayson ignored it at first, assuming it was another reporter. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Judge Grayson," a stern voice called out. "Federal agents, open the door." His stomach lurched. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. He stumbled to his feet, his head spinning from the whiskey and fear. The knocking became a pounding. "Judge Grayson, open up or we will force entry." His legs felt like lead as he shuffled through his once pristine home. Empty bottles littered the hallway. Takeout containers filled the kitchen counter. None of his usual household staff had shown up for days. When he finally reached the front door, his hands shook so badly he could barely turn the handle. 2 agents in dark suits stood on his doorstep, their badges already raised. "Walter Grayson," the first agent said, her voice firm and professional. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice." The second agent already had handcuffs ready. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The cold metal clicked around his wrists and reality crashed in. This wasn't some nightmare he could wake up from. This was really happening. "We need to search the premises," the female agent announced, producing a warrant. "Additional agents will be arriving shortly." They led him outside into the harsh morning light. His neighbors, people who had once begged for invitations to his parties, stood in their driveways watching. Mrs. Henderson, who had always brought him Christmas cookies, quickly turned away. The Petersons, who had sought his help getting their son into law school, whispered behind their hands. Camera flashes exploded as news crews, somehow already alerted, captured his walk of shame. His silk pajamas, now wrinkled and stained, would be splashed across every newspaper in the country. He tried to duck his head, but the male agent kept him moving forward. They loaded him into a black SUV with tinted windows. As they pulled away from his mansion, he caught a glimpse of federal agents in windbreakers entering his home. They would tear through everything, find every secret, expose every deal. The processing at the federal courthouse was methodical and humiliating. They took his fingerprints like a common criminal, pressing each digit into the scanner. The mugshot camera clicked as they made him turn left, then right. "Remove your jewelry," a processing officer instructed. Grayson stared at his signet ring, a symbol of his Harvard law days, and his Rolex watch. Each item dropped into the plastic bin felt like another piece of his identity being stripped away. The holding cell was small and cold, with a metal toilet in the corner and graffiti scratched into the concrete walls. The same walls he had sentenced countless young black men to stare at, now enclosed him. His first request was for a phone call. "I need to contact my attorney," he demanded, trying to summon his judicial authority. The guard barely looked up from his paperwork. "Request denied. You'll have to wait for processing to complete." When he finally did reach his lawyer's office, the response was swift and devastating. "I'm sorry, Judge Grayson," his attorney's secretary said, "but Mr. Davidson has decided to withdraw from your representation. He wishes you the best of luck." Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Briggs and his mother Evelyn sat in his office, watching the arrest unfold on multiple news channels. Evelyn's face remained composed, but her eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she watched Grayson being led away in handcuffs. "Finally," she said, her voice steady, "but it's not over yet." Marcus nodded, adjusting his tie as he stood by the window. "You're right. We need to make sure the entire system that protected him falls apart too. He picked up a thick file from his desk, evidence of other judges, politicians, and prison executives who had enabled Grayson's scheme. The corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. Back in his cell, Grayson sat on the thin mattress, his head in his hands. The dull gray walls seemed to close in with each passing hour. His phone calls went unanswered. Former friends' numbers were suddenly disconnected. Secretaries who had once jumped at his commands now claimed their bosses were indefinitely unavailable. For the first time in his life, Walter Grayson understood what it meant to be truly powerless. No amount of money could open these doors. No political connection could make this go away. No threat could intimidate these walls into moving. He was just another inmate now, waiting for justice to be served. Sometime later, the fluorescent lights in the jail cell buzzed overhead as Immani Briggs lay on the thin mattress, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. She hadn't slept much. The unfamiliar sounds of the jail, metal doors clanging, distant voices echoing, keeping her alert through the night. Her orange jumpsuit felt scratchy against her skin, a constant reminder of where she was. Through the small window in her cell, she could see the first rays of morning sunlight filtering in. Another day behind bars, she thought, trying to push down the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. She closed her eyes, remembering her grandmother's steady presence in the courtroom, the way Evelyn had stood up to Grayson without fear. The sound of footsteps approaching made her sit up. Keys jingled, and then a guard appeared at her cell door. The woman's face was neutral, giving away nothing as she inserted the key into the lock. "Briggs," the guard announced, swinging the door open. "You're going home." Immani's heart skipped a beat. "What?" "You heard me. Get your things together." Immani didn't have much to gather, just the clothes she'd been wearing when they arrested her at the mall. Her hands trembled slightly as she changed out of the jumpsuit in the small bathroom they led her to. Her jeans and hoodie felt like armor after days in prison orange. The processing took what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Paperwork was signed, belongings were returned. Each step brought her closer to freedom, but it didn't feel real until she walked through the final set of doors and saw her father and grandmother waiting. Marcus Briggs stood tall in his perfectly pressed suit, while Evelyn wore one of her signature power blazers. Both of them smiled widely when they saw her, and Immani felt tears threatening to spill over. "Let's get you to the courthouse," Marcus said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Time to end this properly." The ride to the courthouse was quick, but Immani was shocked by what she saw when they arrived. The steps were packed with people holding signs and chanting. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside the courtroom, it was standing room only. The gallery was filled with faces, some familiar, some strange. She recognized civil rights activists she'd seen on TV, local community leaders, and even some of her classmates from school. The new judge, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, called the court to order. She looked nothing like Grayson, and her voice carried genuine warmth as she addressed the room. Having reviewed the evidence, or rather the complete lack thereof, the judge began, and in light of the serious misconduct that has come to light regarding the handling of this case, I am dismissing all charges against Immani Briggs with prejudice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack and the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Evelyn squeezed Immani's hand, while Marcus wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Immani!" A familiar voice cut through the noise, and suddenly Jada Coleman was pushing through the crowd. Her best friend's eyes were bright with tears as she threw her arms around Immani. "Girl, you're trending worldwide," Jada exclaimed, pulling back to show Immani her phone. "Everyone's talking about what happened. You exposed that racist judge for what he really was." Immani glanced at the screen, seeing hashtags with her name and video clips of Grayson being led away in handcuffs. It felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's story unfold. The courthouse steps were even more crowded when they emerged. Camera flashes exploded like lightning, and reporters shouted questions. Immani stood between her father and grandmother, facing the wall of cameras, but she couldn't bring herself to smile. Her mind was already racing ahead, thinking about all the other young people who had sat in Grayson's courtroom over the years. How many of them were still sitting in cells right now? Later that evening, Immani sat on her family's comfortable couch, savoring the taste of her mother's famous pot roast. After days of bland jail food, each bite felt like a gift. The familiar surroundings of their living room, family photos on the walls, her father's law books lined up on shelves, the soft throw blanket she'd had since middle school, helped ground her in the reality that she was truly home. Marcus sat in his favorite armchair, his tie loosened after the long day. Her mother kept bringing more food, as if trying to make up for every meal Immani had missed. Evelyn had taken up residence at the dining room table, legal books spread out around her like a paper fortress. Immani set down her plate, the question that had been burning in her mind all day finally finding its way out. "How many other kids did Grayson put away?" she asked, looking at her grandmother. Evelyn looked up from her books, removing her reading glasses. Her face carried the weight of decades fighting against injustice as she sighed deeply. "Hundreds," she replied simply, the single word heavy with meaning. Immani's jaw clenched, her hands balling into fists in her lap. She thought about all those young people, all those families torn apart by one man's prejudice and greed. The food she'd been enjoying moments ago felt heavy in her stomach. "Then we have more work to do," she said firmly. Meanwhile, Walter Grayson shifted uncomfortably in the hard metal chair of the interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face, which had aged years in just a few days. His expensive suit had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit that scratched against his skin, a constant reminder of his fall from grace. Across the scratched metal table sat his public defender, a young man fresh out of law school who couldn't hide his nervousness. The lawyer shuffled through papers, avoiding direct eye contact with his infamous client. "Your Honor," the lawyer began. "Don't call me that," Grayson snapped, his voice rough with exhaustion. The words felt like acid in his mouth. The title he'd worn so proudly for decades now mocked him. His law degree, carefully framed in his office, was probably being taken down right now. His power, built through years of careful manipulation and backroom deals, had evaporated overnight. His reputation, once sterling in the eyes of society's elite, was now mud. The public defender cleared his throat. "Mr. Grayson, then. The federal prosecutors have submitted their initial evidence list. It's extensive." Grayson's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water cup in front of him. The paper cup crinkled under his grip. Just last week, he'd been drinking from crystal glasses in his private chambers. Now, he couldn't even steady his hands enough to take a proper sip. Outside the interrogation room, phones were ringing constantly, as news of his downfall spread through the justice system like wildfire. One by one, his carefully cultivated connections began to crumble. The governor, who had attended numerous fundraising dinners at Grayson's mansion, held a press conference denouncing him. The allegations against former Judge Grayson represent a betrayal of public trust of the highest order, the politician declared, his face stern for the cameras. If proven true, these actions have no place in our justice system. Grayson's phone privileges in jail allowed him to make one call to his country club, where he'd been a member for 30 years. The club secretary's voice was cold and formal. "Your membership has been revoked, Mr. Grayson. The board's decision is unanimous and final." His investment partners moved even faster. Within hours of his arrest, they had frozen his accounts and dissolved their business relationships. Millions in assets were suddenly beyond his reach, tied up in legal proceedings and federal investigations. The isolation grew deeper when his family stopped accepting his calls. His wife's lawyer delivered divorce papers to his cell. His children changed their numbers. Even his sister, who he'd helped put through medical school, released a statement distancing herself from him. Sitting in his tiny cell, Grayson watched helplessly as decades of careful planning and social climbing unraveled like a cheap sweater. The concrete walls seemed to close in a little more each day. His cellmate, a young drug offender, avoided speaking to him entirely. Even criminals had standards, it seemed. The heavy steel door of his cell opened with a metallic groan. A guard stood there, face impassive. "Your lawyer's here again." In the same dreary interrogation room, his public defender looked even more uncomfortable than before. The young man's tie was slightly askew, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. "There's been a development," the lawyer said, shuffling papers nervously. "Your former court clerk, Patricia Wilson, she's made a deal with the prosecutors." Grayson's stomach dropped. Patricia had been his right hand for 15 years. She knew everything, every case he'd fixed, every bribe he'd taken, every racist comment he'd made behind closed doors. "She's agreed to testify against you in exchange for immunity," the lawyer continued. "She's already provided documents, emails, recordings." Grayson's head spun. Recordings? He thought back to all the conversations in his chambers, all the things he'd said when he thought no one was listening. "They have enough evidence to bury you," his lawyer said bluntly, finally meeting his eyes. "The federal prosecutors are talking about multiple life sentences. The racial bias alone—" "Enough," Grayson whispered, his voice barely audible. The lawyer pressed on. "They're offering a deal. 25 years if you plead guilty to all charges and cooperate with ongoing investigations into other officials involved in the private prison scheme." 25 years. Grayson did the math in his head. He was 62 now. If he took the deal, he'd be 87 before he saw freedom again, if he lived that long. The reality of his situation crashed over him like a wave. No more mahogany-paneled chambers. No more deferential lawyers calling him "Your Honor." No more power to decide the fates of others. No more anything. Grayson closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. The breath seemed to carry the last remnants of his former life with it. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he faced the truth that had been building since his arrest. He was completely, utterly alone. Hours later, the fluorescent lights hummed softly in the conference room, as Immani and Evelyn sat surrounded by towering stacks of manila folders. Each one contained a story, a young life derailed by Judge Grayson's corrupt rulings. The sheer volume of cases made Immani's stomach turn. "How did he get away with this for so long?" Immani asked, running her finger down yet another case file. Her grandmother sat across from her, reading glasses perched on her nose as she examined document after document. "The system protected him," Evelyn replied, her voice heavy with decades of experience. "And people were too afraid to speak up." She picked up another folder, adding it to the growing priority pile. "But now we have the proof we need." Immani pulled a file from the stack closest to her. Inside was a photo of a girl about her age, Ashley Thompson. According to the paperwork, she'd been sentenced to 18 months in juvenile detention for allegedly stealing makeup from a drugstore. The security footage that would have proven her innocence had conveniently disappeared, just like in Immani's case. "Look at this one, Grandma," Immani said, sliding the file across the table. The store owner later admitted he never saw her take anything, but Grayson wouldn't allow the testimony. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she reviewed the details. Classic Grayson. The sentence was completely disproportionate, and the evidence was flimsy at best. She made a note on her legal pad. "We'll add her case to the first batch of appeals." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, sorting cases by severity and gathering evidence of Grayson's pattern of discrimination. The conference room walls, once bare, were now covered with charts and timelines showing connections between cases. As the sun set outside, Immani remained focused on the files. Even though she should have been working on her senior year homework, this felt more important. Her own brush with injustice had opened her eyes to a broken system that needed fixing. She picked up another folder and found herself looking at the face of Marcus Washington, a 16-year-old honor student. Grayson had sentenced him to 2 years for resisting arrest when a mall security guard mistook him for someone else. The boy's dreams of attending college were put on hold. "This isn't right," Immani muttered, adding more notes to her growing spreadsheet. Her laptop screen glowed in the dimming room as she documented patterns in Grayson's sentencing. Meanwhile, across town in the federal courthouse, Marcus Briggs sat in a high-security conference room with a team of prosecutors. The walls were lined with evidence boards showing complex webs of corruption. "The private prison connections go deeper than we thought," one prosecutor explained, pointing to a chart. "Grayson was just one piece of the puzzle. We've found similar patterns with at least 3 other judges in neighboring districts." Marcus leaned forward, his face grim. "Show me the money trail." The lead investigator pulled up financial records on a large screen. These companies created shell corporations to hide payments to judicial campaigns. Every time a judge sent them more juveniles, more money flowed through these fake businesses. And the corporations? Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. Major profits, another prosecutor confirmed. They were making thousands per kid per month. Free labor, government contracts, kickbacks from service providers. It was a gold mine. All they needed was a steady supply of young offenders. Marcus thought of his daughter, how easily she could have become another statistic in their profit margin. His jaw clenched. I want every connection mapped. Every judge, every corporation, every politician who turned a blind eye. No one gets away with this. The team worked late into the night, piecing together the vast network that had enabled Grayson's crimes. It wasn't just about one corrupt judge anymore. It was about dismantling an entire system built on exploiting black youth. Back in the conference room, Immani rubbed her tired eyes but refused to stop working. The stack of files seemed endless, each one representing a young person whose future had been stolen. Evelyn noticed her granddaughter's exhaustion. Maybe we should call it a night, baby girl. These files will still be here tomorrow. But Immani shook her head, reaching for another folder. Just one more, she said, opening it to find the photo of a 15-year-old boy named David Carter. His crime? Stealing a backpack. Grayson's sentence? 5 years in juvenile detention. The unfairness of it hit Immani hard. She gripped the file tighter, her knuckles turning white. This could have been her brother, her cousin, her friend. This could have been her, if her family hadn't had the resources to fight back. She looked up at her grandmother, determination burning in her eyes. We're getting them all out. The conviction in her voice echoed through the quiet room. Evelyn saw in her granddaughter's face the same fire that had driven her own fights for justice decades ago. The torch was being passed to a new generation. Sometime later, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Immani Briggs walked through the sterile hallways of Ashford Juvenile Detention Center. Each step echoed against the cold concrete floors, reminding her of her own brief time behind bars. Though she was free now, the weight of invisible chains still pressed down on her shoulders, not her own, but those of countless other black youth trapped within these walls. A tired-looking social worker named Ms. Peterson led the way, her sensible shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Her gray cardigan seemed to match the dull walls surrounding them, as if the building's bleakness had slowly seeped into her very being over the years. Remember what I said, Ms. Peterson warned, her voice carrying a mix of resignation and practiced detachment. Don't get their hopes up. These kids have been through enough disappointment. Immani didn't respond. She'd heard similar warnings before. Well-meaning adults who'd given up on change, who'd accepted the system's brokenness as inevitable. But Immani refused to accept that. She straightened her shoulders as they approached the meeting room. Through the wire-reinforced window, she could see 5 young inmates already seated inside. They watched her with wary eyes as she entered, their orange jumpsuits a stark contrast against the pale institutional walls. Some slouched in their chairs, affecting disinterest, while others sat rigid with barely contained tension. Ms. Peterson gestured to an empty chair at the head of the table. "You have 45 minutes," she said, before stepping back to observe from the corner. Immani took her seat, placing her leather notebook on the table. She looked at each face before her, seeing reflections of herself in their guarded expressions. "My name is Immani Briggs," she began, her voice steady and clear. "And I'm here because Judge Grayson put me in chains too." That got their attention. Backs straightened, eyes focused. "I was lucky," she continued. "I had family who could fight back, but I know not everyone does. That's why I'm here." One by one, they began to share their stories. Dante Williams spoke first, his lanky frame hunched forward as if trying to make himself smaller. At 16, he'd already spent 8 months inside for allegedly stealing a pair of designer sneakers. The store owner even came forward later, Dante said, his fingers fidgeting with the sleeve of his jumpsuit. Said he made a mistake, that it wasn't me. But Grayson wouldn't listen. 5 years just like that. Mariah Jackson went next. She was 15 with tight braids and eyes that seemed too old for her face. "I was at the mall with my friends," she explained. "This security guard kept following us around. When I asked why, he grabbed my arm. I pulled away and he shoved me into a wall. Then he said I assaulted him." She laughed bitterly. There was video showing what really happened, but Grayson wouldn't allow it in court. Tyrick Robinson's story made Immani's blood boil. 17 years old honor roll student stopped while driving his mother's car. "Cop said he smelled weed," Tyrick recalled, his voice tight with anger. "Tore the whole car apart. Never found anything, but Grayson still gave me 18 months for resisting arrest when I questioned the search." With each story, Immani took careful notes, documenting dates, details, witnesses. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, but her determination only grew stronger. These weren't just cases. They were lives interrupted, futures derailed, families torn apart. The fifth youth had remained silent throughout, watching Immani with cold, calculating eyes. Finally, he stood up, his movement deliberate and challenging. Jordan Taylor, 15 years old, but with the hardened gaze of someone much older. "We've heard this before," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "People come in here, say they'll help, make all kinds of promises." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "And then they leave. They always leave." The other kids nodded in agreement, their brief moments of hope already fading. They'd been burned too many times before, had too many advocates and lawyers and social workers make promises they couldn't keep. But Immani didn't flinch from Jordan's stare. She met his gaze steadily, seeing past the anger to the pain beneath. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice firm and clear. "And I'm not losing." She opened her notebook wider, showing them the detailed timelines and connections she'd already mapped out. "Grayson's empire is falling. He's in federal custody right now, and we're building cases to overturn every single wrongful conviction he handed down, including all of yours." The room grew very quiet. Even Ms. Peterson stepped closer, interest breaking through her professional detachment. "I can't promise it will be quick," Immani continued, "but I can promise you this. I won't stop until every one of you gets justice. Because what happened to you? It happened to me too. And I'm done letting people like Grayson destroy our lives." Jordan remained standing, studying her face for any sign of deception. Finally, he asked, "Why should we believe you?" Immani pulled out her phone and showed them news coverage of Grayson's arrest. Then she shared photos of the protests outside the courthouse, the community rising up in support. "Because I'm not fighting alone," she explained. "We have federal prosecutors, civil rights lawyers, and community activists all working together. The whole system that protected Grayson is being exposed." When her 45 minutes were up, Ms. Peterson stepped forward to end the meeting. But before Immani left, she made sure each teen had her contact information. "I'll be back next week," she promised. "Start writing down everything you remember about your cases. Every detail matters." That evening, Immani sat at her kitchen table, spreading out the new case files alongside her notes from the detention center visit. Her grandmother, Evelyn, watched from the doorway as Immani arranged the documents with careful precision. Immani looked up at her grandmother, her jaw set with determination. "We start with Jordan," she declared, pulling his file to the center of the table. Days later, Walter Grayson shifted uncomfortably in the hard wooden chair of the federal courtroom, his once commanding presence now diminished by weeks in detention. His expensive suit, previously a symbol of his power and status, hung loosely on his frame, wrinkled from too many days of wear. Gray had crept into his temples, spreading like frost across his dark hair, making him look every bit his 63 years. Before him lay a stack of papers that would determine the rest of his life. A plea deal. The terms were clear. Plead guilty to corruption, bribery, and civil rights violations in exchange for 20 years instead of life. His public defender, James Morton, a young man who probably wasn't even born when Grayson first took the bench, leaned toward him. "Take it," Morton whispered, his voice carrying an edge of urgency. "The evidence is overwhelming. If this goes to trial, you'll never see the outside of a prison again." Grayson's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water glass in front of him. The cool liquid did nothing to wash away the bitter taste in his mouth. Around him, the federal prosecutors watched with barely concealed satisfaction, 3 of them all wearing crisp suits that reminded him of what he'd lost. Lead prosecutor Sarah Chen tapped her pen against the table. "The offer expires in 48 hours, Your Honor." The last 2 words dripped with sarcasm. "After that, we proceed to trial with all charges." Grayson's jaw clenched at her tone. He'd sentenced her cousin to juvenile detention 5 years ago for shoplifting. Now here she was, holding his fate in her hands. The irony wasn't lost on him. His mind wandered to everything he'd already lost. His son, Michael, hadn't answered his calls in weeks. The last time they spoke, Michael had told him never to contact his grandchildren again. The beautiful colonial house where he'd hosted countless dinner parties had been foreclosed, its contents seized as evidence. Harrison and Wade, the prestigious law firm where he'd started his career 40 years ago, had removed his portrait from their wall of alumni. His name had been scrubbed from their website as if he'd never existed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh glare reflecting off the polished table surface. Grayson studied his reflection, the deep lines around his mouth, the dark circles under his eyes, the defeated slump of his shoulders. This was rock bottom. But even now, a familiar spark of defiance flickered in his chest. If he was going down, he'd do it on his terms. A smirk played across his lips as he looked up at Chen. "I'll take the deal," he said, watching their faces light up with victory. "But on one condition." The room fell silent. Morton shifted nervously beside him, while the prosecutors exchanged wary glances. "I want to see Immani Briggs one last time." Chen's pen stopped mid-tap. "Absolutely not." "Then no deal." Grayson leaned back in his chair, feeling a ghost of his old power return. "I want 15 minutes with her before I sign, in a supervised setting, of course." "You're in no position to make demands," Chen snapped. "Oh, but I am." His smirk widened. "You want this wrapped up quietly. A trial would be messy, expensive, and very public. Plus, I still have friends in high places who might not appreciate their names being dragged through the mud." Morton grabbed his arm. "Judge Grayson, I strongly advise against—" "Shut up," Grayson hissed, then turned back to Chen. 15 minutes with Immani Briggs. That's my price." Chen stood up, gathering her papers. "We'll take it under consideration." Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she left, her fellow prosecutors following in her wake. Alone with his lawyer, Grayson pulled out a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket, a letter he'd written the night before. The pages were covered in his precise handwriting, every word carefully chosen. "Make sure this gets to her with the request," he told Morton. When the letter reached Immani later that day, she was sitting in her grandmother's study, reviewing case files of other teens Grayson had sentenced. The manila envelope arrived by courier, marked with federal stamps. As she read Grayson's request, her hands began to shake with fury. The letter that accompanied it fell to the floor, its pages scattering across the hardwood. Marcus Briggs, who had been working nearby, rushed to his daughter's side. He picked up the scattered pages, scanning their contents with growing concern. "Baby girl, you don't have to do this," he said softly, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "No one would blame you for saying no." Immani stared at the letter in her father's hands. Her heart pounded with anger, with fear, with something else she couldn't quite name. The man who had tried to destroy her life now wanted to see her one last time before accepting his punishment. She thought of Jordan and the other teens still locked away, of Dante, Mariah, and Tyrek, of all the lives Grayson had casually ruined from behind his bench. With steady hands, she took the letter from her father. The paper was expensive, the kind Grayson had probably used to write countless unjust sentences. She folded it carefully, creasing each edge with deliberate precision. "I'll go," she said, her voice firm and clear. Marcus started to protest, but something in his daughter's expression stopped him. This wasn't the scared teenager who had called him from jail just weeks ago. This was a warrior who had brought down a corrupt judge and was now fighting to free others from his legacy. "I'll go," she repeated, tucking the folded letter into her pocket, "because I want him to see exactly who beat him." The federal interrogation room was a stark contrast to Judge Grayson's former chambers. Instead of rich mahogany and leather, cold metal and concrete surrounded them. Two federal agents stood silently in the corners, their presence a constant reminder that Grayson's power had crumbled. Immani sat straight-backed in her chair, her posture reflecting a strength that went beyond her 17 years. Across the steel table, Walter Grayson looked diminished. His prison jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. But when he looked at her, that familiar cruel glint remained, like a snake waiting to strike. "I wanted to see the girl who destroyed me," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. The words scraped against the silence of the room. Immani didn't flinch. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, prepared herself for his attempts to intimidate her. Her grandmother's words echoed in her head. "Never let them see you shake." Grayson leaned forward slightly, his handcuffs clinking against the table. "You think you've won something here?" A ghost of his old smirk played across his lips. "You're just a child playing at justice. People like me will always be in power. Always. For every judge you take down, there are 10 more ready to take their place." His words carried the same arrogant tone he'd used in the courtroom, but now it rang hollow in the sterile interrogation room. Still, he pressed on, desperate to maintain some semblance of control. "The system doesn't change just because one piece falls," he continued. "It's bigger than you, bigger than your family, bigger than all your little protests and social media campaigns." Immani absorbed his words without reaction. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. The sound of it hitting the metal table echoed through the room. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This is bigger than me." She opened the folder, spreading out dozens of case files. Young faces stared up from the papers, all black teenagers, all sentenced by Grayson to excessive terms in private detention centers. "But you're wrong about everything else," Immani continued. "You didn't lose to me. You lost to yourself. Your greed, your hatred, your belief that you could keep hurting people forever without consequences. That's what destroyed you." She picked up one file and read from it. Marcus Thompson, 15 years old, sentenced to 3 years for stealing a candy bar, currently in his second year at Riverside Detention Center. She looked up at Grayson. "His case review is next week." Grayson's jaw tightened, but Immani wasn't finished. She picked up another file. Sarah Jenkins, 16, 18 months for resisting arrest when a school resource officer grabbed her without cause. Her family couldn't afford a lawyer. She laid the file down carefully. She's being released tomorrow. One by one, Immani went through the files, each story a damning testimony to Grayson's corruption. With each name, each face, each injustice revealed, his composure cracked further. "These kids are going free," she said, her voice gaining strength. "One by one. And every time we overturn a case, people will remember your name, for all the wrong reasons." For the first time since she'd entered the room, Grayson's expression changed. The arrogance faltered, replaced by something she'd never seen before: fear. His hands, resting on the table, began to tremble slightly. "You can't," he started, but his voice cracked. "We can. We are." Immani gathered the files back into the folder with precise movements. "Every appeal, every overturned conviction, every freed child will be another nail in the coffin of your legacy. You won't be remembered as the powerful Judge Grayson. You'll be remembered as the corrupt man who preyed on black children for profit." Grayson's face had gone pale, the reality of his complete defeat finally sinking in. He wasn't just losing his freedom, he was losing his entire life's work, his reputation, everything he'd built through decades of corruption and racism. Immani stood up, tucking the folder back into her bag. The metal chair scraped against the concrete floor, the sound sharp and final. She took a moment to straighten her jacket, just as she'd seen her grandmother do countless times in court. Walking to the door, she paused with her hand on the handle. Looking over her shoulder, she delivered her final words to the man who had tried to destroy her life. "You wanted to see me?" Her voice carried the weight of victory. Now you get to watch me win." Grayson sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly open, but no words came out. The once powerful judge had nothing left to say. The heavy door closed behind Immani with a definitive click, leaving Grayson alone with the federal agents and the crushing weight of his complete defeat. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of Courtroom 302, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Immani and Evelyn Briggs walked down the center aisle with measured steps, their heels clicking against the marble floor. The gallery was packed with observers, journalists, activists, and families of other wrongfully convicted youth. At the defense table sat Jordan Taylor, his shoulders tense in his borrowed suit. Dark circles under his eyes revealed sleepless nights spent wondering if freedom was really possible. His mother sat directly behind him in the gallery, clutching a worn Bible in her trembling hands. Immani set her briefcase on the table with practiced precision, just as she'd watched her grandmother do countless times. Though her heart raced beneath her crisp blazer, her hands remained steady as she arranged their files. This wasn't just their first case since Grayson's fall. It was Jordan's last chance at justice. Across the aisle, District Attorney Patricia Reynolds shuffled her papers with an air of dismissal. Her reputation for being tough on crime had earned her multiple re-elections, and she wasn't about to let a teenager's overturned conviction tarnish that record. She shot a condescending glance toward Immani, clearly unimpressed by the presence of a high school student at the defense table. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The Honorable Judge Michael Chen presiding. Judge Chen entered the courtroom, his robes flowing behind him. Unlike Grayson's cruel smirk, Chen's face held a careful neutrality that gave Immani hope. He was known for his fairness, for actually reading every brief submitted to his court. "You may be seated," he said, settling into his chair. "We're here today regarding case number 2023 CV1847, the appeal of Jordan Taylor's conviction. Ms. Briggs, you may proceed." Evelyn rose slowly, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Thank you, Your Honor. Today we will present irrefutable evidence that Jordan Taylor's conviction was not just wrong. It was part of a systematic effort to criminalize Black youth in our community." Dia Reynolds stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is making inflammatory statements." "I'm simply stating the facts we'll prove today," Evelyn interrupted smoothly. "Facts that the district attorney's office has chosen to ignore for years." Judge Chen leaned forward. "I'll allow it. Continue, Ms. Briggs." For the next 2 hours, Evelyn methodically dismantled Jordan's conviction. She presented security footage showing Jordan was 3 miles away at a basketball game when the alleged crime occurred. She revealed how the original police report contained racist language and assumptions. She demonstrated how Judge Grayson had rushed the sentencing, denying Jordan proper representation. Immani supported her grandmother's arguments by managing their evidence presentation, pulling up exactly the right document or video clip at exactly the right moment. Each piece fit perfectly into their narrative of injustice. "And now," Evelyn said, "I'd like to present evidence of a disturbing pattern in Judge Grayson's sentencing practices." She projected a graph onto the courtroom screen. The data was clear. Black teenagers received sentences 3 to 5 times longer than white teenagers for similar offenses. Jordan's case wasn't an anomaly. It was part of Grayson's deliberate strategy. DA Reynolds fought back, arguing procedure and precedent, but her arguments felt hollow against the weight of truth. When she claimed Jordan's conviction followed proper protocols, Evelyn simply played the rushed hearing tape, letting Grayson's biased comments speak for themselves. Throughout it all, Jordan sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the judge. He'd learned in detention that hope was dangerous, that it could break you worse than any guard's baton. But watching Evelyn and Immani fight for him, he felt something crack in his careful armor of cynicism. Finally, Judge Chen raised his hand, signaling he'd heard enough. The courtroom fell silent as he reviewed his notes, each second stretching like an hour. Jordan's mother gripped her Bible tighter, her prayers a whispered soundtrack to the tension. Then Judge Chen looked up, his gaze finding Jordan's. "Mr. Taylor, would you please stand?" Jordan rose on shaky legs, his borrowed suit suddenly feeling too tight. Immani reached over and squeezed his hand quickly before letting go. Having reviewed all evidence presented today, I find that your conviction was wrongful and unjust. Judge Chen's voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. This conviction is overturned. You are free to go. For a moment, Jordan didn't move. The words seemed to hover in the air, too precious to be real. Then a sob broke the silence. His mother, rising from her seat with tears streaming down her face. The reality hit him in waves. Free. He was free. Tears spilled down his cheeks as his mother rushed forward, wrapping him in an embrace that spoke of 2 years of separation, of visits through plexiglass, of nights spent praying for this very moment. "My baby," she whispered, holding him tight. "My baby boy is coming home." Immani watched them, her own eyes filling with tears. This was why they fought. This was what justice looked like, not just words in a law book, but families reunited, wrongs made right, hope restored. She turned to find Evelyn watching her, a proud smile on her face. "One down," Immani said softly, thinking of all the other files waiting on their office desk. Hundreds to go. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows of the Washington, D.C. courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Immani Briggs's heels clicked purposefully against the polished surface as she walked, her stride confident and measured. In her right hand, she clutched a well-worn case folder. In her left, she held something equally precious, a cream-colored envelope bearing the crimson seal of Harvard Law School. The acceptance letter had arrived that morning, but Immani hadn't allowed herself more than a moment to celebrate. There was work to be done first. The weight of 3 more wrongfully convicted teenagers' futures pressed heavily on her shoulders, more important than any personal triumph. The past year had transformed her. Gone was the frightened teenager in Grayson's courtroom. In her place stood a young woman who had helped free dozens of wrongfully convicted youth, working tirelessly alongside her grandmother to dismantle the corrupt system Grayson had built. As she approached courtroom 415, Immani tucked the Harvard letter into her briefcase. The familiar pre-trial butterflies danced in her stomach, but they no longer made her hands shake. If anything, they sharpened her focus. Inside the courtroom, 3 families sat in the gallery, their faces etched with worry and hope. Immani had spent months working with them, learning their stories, gathering evidence. Marcus Johnson, age 16, convicted of armed robbery despite being in school when the crime occurred. Tasha Washington, 15, sentenced for drug possession, though the substances were never found. Derek Collins, 17, imprisoned for assault even though security footage showed he was defending himself. Evelyn Briggs was already at the defense table, arranging documents with practiced precision. She looked up as Immani approached, offering a small nod. They didn't need words anymore. A year of working together had taught them to read each other's smallest gestures. "All rise," the bailiff called out. "The Honorable Judge Sarah Martinez presiding." Judge Martinez entered, her robes flowing behind her. She was known for her fairness and attention to detail, exactly what these cases needed. "You may be seated," she said, settling into her chair. "We're here today regarding 3 appeals. Ms. Briggs, you may proceed." Immani stood, smoothing her blazer. The nervous energy that once plagued her had transformed into fuel, driving her forward. "Thank you, Your Honor. Today we present evidence that these 3 convictions were not just wrong. They were part of a systematic effort to criminalize Black youth, orchestrated by former Judge Walter Grayson." She moved with confidence to the presentation screen, pulling up carefully organized evidence. Security footage showing Marcus Johnson in his math class during the alleged robbery. Witness statements confirming Tasha Washington never possessed any drugs. The full video of Derek Collins defending himself against an attacker. "Your Honor," Immani continued, her voice clear and strong, "these cases follow the exact pattern we've uncovered in dozens of Grayson's rulings. Rushed hearings, ignored evidence, excessive sentences, all targeting Black teenagers." The district attorney tried to object, but Immani was prepared. She presented statistics, testimony from former court officials, patterns of racial bias so clear they couldn't be denied. Each argument was delivered with a precision that made several observers whisper about how much she reminded them of Evelyn. Hours passed as Immani methodically dismantled each conviction. She showed how Grayson had violated procedures, ignored evidence, and rushed judgments. The families in the gallery watched with growing hope as their children's innocence became increasingly clear. Judge Martinez reviewed the evidence carefully, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she looked up, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "Marcus Johnson, please stand." Marcus rose slowly, his mother gripping the bench behind him. "Based on the evidence presented, your conviction is hereby overturned. You are free to go." Marcus's mother burst into tears as the judge continued. "Tasha Washington." Tasha stood, trembling slightly. "Your conviction is overturned. You are free." Derek Collins. Derek rose, tall and proud despite his fear. "Your conviction is overturned. You are free as well." The courtroom erupted in joy. Families rushed forward, embracing their children. Tears flowed freely as parents held their kids for the first time without guards watching. The sound of relief and happiness filled the air. Immani closed her eyes, letting the moment wash over her. This feeling, this was what justice felt like. This was why she fought so hard. Each overturned conviction was another life restored, another family made whole. Later that evening, Immani drove to Ashford Juvenile Detention Center one final time. The familiar gray walls loomed before her, but they held no power anymore. Not over her, and not over the dozens of youth she'd helped free. She found Jordan in the visitors area, talking quietly with some of his friends who were still inside. He looked different now, stronger, more confident. Freedom had restored something in him that detention had tried to break. Jordan spotted her and smiled, excusing himself from his friends. "Heard about today's cases," he said, approaching her. 3 more free." "Told you I wouldn't lose," Immani replied, smiling back. Jordan's smirk was knowing, almost proud. "I never doubted you." Immani looked up at the darkening sky through the visitor room's barred windows. Tomorrow, she would leave for Harvard, ready to learn new ways to fight for justice. But tonight, she was still here, still fighting for those who needed her most. The late spring sun bathed Harvard Yard in golden light as thousands of people filled the rows of chairs, their excitement palpable in the warm air. The historic buildings stood sentinel around them, witnesses to countless graduations before, but this one felt different. On the stage, decorated with crimson and white flowers, Immani Briggs stood at the podium, her graduation robe flowing in the gentle breeze. Her fingers brushed the smooth wood of the podium as she looked out over the sea of faces. Somewhere in that crowd sat Jordan, now a sophomore at Boston University. Next to him were 3 more teens she'd helped free, all now in college themselves. Her grandmother Evelyn sat in the front row, elegant as always, while her father Marcus beamed with pride beside her. The weight of the moment settled on Immani's shoulders. 4 years ago, she'd stood in a cold jail cell, accused of a crime she didn't commit. Now she stood here, having graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School. The journey between those 2 moments had changed not just her life, but hundreds of others. Immani took a deep breath, her voice clear and strong as she began to speak. "When I was 17, I learned something that no teenager should have to learn," she said, her words carrying across the hushed crowd. "I learned that justice doesn't come easy, that the system wasn't built for people like me." The crowd grew quieter, drawn in by the power of her story. "I was falsely accused of shoplifting, arrested without cause, and thrown before a corrupt judge who had built his career destroying young black lives." Immani's voice remained steady, though her heart raced at the memory. "Judge Walter Grayson thought he could silence me, break me, make me just another statistic in his twisted game." She paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. "But I also learned something else that day. I learned that we don't have to accept injustice. We don't have to bow to corrupt power. We can fight back." The morning sun caught the tears in some people's eyes as Immani continued. "In the past 4 years while studying here at Harvard, I've worked with my grandmother, the legendary civil rights attorney Evelyn Briggs, to overturn over 200 wrongful convictions. 200 young lives that Grayson tried to destroy. 200 futures he tried to steal. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many knew her story. It had made national headlines, but hearing it from her own lips carried a different power. I was lucky, Immani said, her voice softening. I had a family who could fight for me. I had a grandmother who knew the law inside and out. I had a father who could make the system listen. She gripped the podium tighter. But there are still hundreds of kids out there waiting for someone to fight for them. We can't let them wait any longer. The crowd erupted in applause, but Immani wasn't finished. Today, as we graduate from one of the most prestigious law schools in the world, we have a choice to make. Will we use our education to maintain the status quo, or will we use it to reshape the system that has failed so many? Her words rang across the yard, clear and challenging. Walter Grayson sits in a federal prison now, but the system that enabled him still exists. Private prisons still profit from black bodies. Corrupt judges still sit on benches. Police still target black youth. She leaned forward slightly, her voice growing more intense. But we have the power to change that, every single one of us. Whether we become prosecutors or defense attorneys, whether we work in corporate law or public interest, we all have the power to demand better, to fight harder, to make justice more than just a word. The applause was deafening now, people rising to their feet. I stand here today not just as a Harvard Law graduate, but as living proof that the system can be beaten, that justice can prevail. But the fight isn't over. It's just beginning. As Immani finished her speech, the entire crowd stood, their applause thunderous. Some wiped tears from their eyes, while others nodded firmly, clearly moved by her words. After the ceremony, Immani found her family waiting in the shade of an old oak tree. Evelyn stepped forward first, pulling her granddaughter into a tight embrace. Her voice was thick with emotion as she whispered, "Your grandfather would be so damn proud of you." Immani held her grandmother tighter, remembering all the late nights they'd spent poring over case files, all the courtroom battles they'd fought together. Every victory, every setback had led to this moment. Marcus stepped forward next, his eyes shining with pride. He held out a cream-colored envelope, official government seals visible on its surface. Immani's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, pulling out a letter with the Department of Justice letterhead. Her eyes scanned the words quickly, then again more slowly, letting their meaning sink in. The U.S. Justice Department was offering her a position in their Civil Rights Division. She gripped the letter tightly, feeling the weight of its significance. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an opportunity to fight for justice from within the very system that had once tried to destroy her. In her bag, worn and dog-eared from constant use, sat her copy of the new Jim Crow, the book that had opened her eyes to the systemic nature of racial injustice in America's legal system. She'd carried it with her throughout law school, a reminder of why she was fighting. If you enjoyed the story of Immani, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.